Welcome. It's wonderful to have you all here. Very excited for this presentation. Today we are hosting Ed Lopez. Ed, as many of you know, or this is probably the role you know him best for, is the executive executive director of the Public Choice Society. And we are all awaiting that big announcement, right? Is it in person? But we won't torture you with that today, Ed.
Yeah.
So he's also a professor at Western Carolina University, where he runs. He's a founding director of the Center for the Study of Free Enterprise. And his past research used sort of a traditional methods like econometrics to look at the term limits, eminent domain, teacher pay, and community assignments, among many other topics. And in his new or current research, he's taking more of an epistemic approach, looking at the cognitive origins of institutions. And that's probably where today's paper belongs, right?
Right.
Co-production of knowledge, bottom-up socialism, and coordination between think tanks and academia, among many other topics. And according to his bio sketch, there is a book in the plans on the reframing design copies as adaptive imitative entrepreneurs, which sounds absolutely fascinating. So keep us posted about that, Ed. And with that, thank you for joining us today, and the screen is all yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Marta. Everybody, nice to see y'all. I know most of y'all, not everybody, but most, and some of us are old friends. Like I just saw Roger throw a wave. Not everybody's on my screen, so I'm not sure if you're throwing waves or not, but I just happened to see Roger Koppel do that. So yeah, I think that it bears mentioning, I have a couple of cats. They might webinar bomb us. I have a couple of kids. They might do the same thing. They come home from school in about an hour. And I'll use that to segue that sometimes I describe what I do as, while I have a 12-year-old boy named Lorenzo, I have a 9-year-old girl named Ivana, I have a 60-year-old very needy child named the Public Choice Society. And then I also have this 5-year-old startup named Center for Study of Free Enterprise. And yeah, that's what I do. So, you know, in a way, that's a bit of a segue to the paper, because I think that what I've been able to do is see a lot of work in public choice from a lot of different areas coming across on my desk in the form of paper proposals and so forth. And maybe I'm connecting dots that I wouldn't have otherwise. But I think that this paper kind of is maybe connecting some dots from some of the previous work I've done, a little bit of which Marta mentioned. So, but I do want to frame it as I'm coming at this from an empirical, preoccupied with empirical questions, is what brings me to these problems of institutional formation. So I tell the story about the Greenway. And here's on the screen, you should be able to see the slide that shows the design of the Greenway that I'm talking about. Actually, it's as you enter, the sign says all pets must be on a leash, but when you're on the Greenway itself, it's pretty clear that the rule in use is no pets are on a leash, and encounters are prevented and things like that in other ways besides leashing the pets. And so I think that encapsulates a lot of issues that confront scholars who use institutions in their work. And I'm categorizing those issues as questions of institutional formation and institutional change, and also institutional alignment. And so just to sort of roadmap us a little bit, I'm going to fill that in a little bit with some more motivation of U.S. fiscal history, my work a little bit on with Pete Calcano on that. And then just a quick mention of a couple of other examples that I talk about in the paper. I'll go on to the framework where I'm sort of combining elements from Searle and Ostrom and a couple of others to set a framework for how institutions can be defined as forming and changing and aligning. And then I'm going to explain how I adapt that framework to define some logical conditions and categories for getting at those three things. Again, institutional formation, change, and alignment. And I'll come back to sort of showing how it can be used to organize the thoughts that I introduced on US fiscal history, and then maybe how it can be used as a platform for future empirical work. So to get on with that, I do want to mention how I was a student at George Mason in the mid-90s, and Professor Wagner was my teacher in Austrian 1 and Austrian 2, and was overseeing a lot of dissertations at the time. I ended up writing my dissertation under Bob Tollefson, but Dick, much of your work that I've sort of absorbed over the years, I find working its way into questions that I ask and tools that I bring to the table to try to get at those questions. And I have to confess, it's even more than I had realized, because in prepping for this talk, I began to sort of see myself connecting more explicitly some of the things that I'm doing and then some of the published work that I've done to your work. And so let me start making good on that comment by looking at a little bit of work I did with Pete Calcano on US fiscal history. And so this is in Journal of Institutional Economics 2016. You all should cite it. Thank you. All right, I won't do that again. I'll try not to. But basically what I'm trying to do here, let me move this up a little bit if I can, so you might be able to see it better. What we're doing here is we look back to, when we have records of the US federal budget. And the red bars are current federal debt, and the blue line is current deficit or surplus. And we're using nominal dollars, not inflated, not adjusted. And so what I want to do is I want to show four periods here. And this first period is the founding, 1800 or so, to about mid-19th century. And what you see here, what we detect and what we explain with a little bit of economic history is a pattern of running deficits during periods of genuine national emergency, wars and fiscal crises, banking crises, but then subsequently running surpluses and diminishing that debt. And you see a couple of cycles of that in this period. As we move forward in the next period, on this chart, we have 1858 to 1914. You have, of course, the U.S. Civil War period here, and we're going to, use 1880 as a line of demarcation when this pattern of that we see in the first part of the 19th century of running deficits only in times of genuine national emergency and then paying them down later begins to deteriorate. And you see that moving forward where the debt does not decline and the surpluses are not as big. You see that moving into the 20th century. The scale's a little weird here because World War II is such a large increase compared to the period before it. But again, you see the pattern after World War II. You do see a string of surpluses, but they're relatively small in magnitude because the debt continues to climb. We have from there in the modern budget era sort of a mixed bag. We begin to have deficits in periods where we don't have genuine national emergency. And then as we move to the fourth of these slides that I'll show you, we have that begin in the modern budget era, 74 and forward. That's the dominant pattern where, except for a few years in the late 90s, we have chronic deficits and mounting public debt. You know what the picture looks like as we continue forward in the data compared to what's on the screen there. So the story there is one of that Pete and I try to organize. Some of where the inspiration from Professor Wagner's work comes in. We go back to that 1880 period or so, and we see some political economy changes afoot. And I try to sort of zoom in on this by considering an item G that's proposed for the federal budget. And item G is something that at a discussion over the dinner table on Main Street strikes the family as being something either that the federal government should be doing in their normative assessment or not. And that could be said also for, say, local officials or elected officials at the local, state, or federal level. They'll have a sense of item G and in their normative assessment, whether it's something that ought to belong in what the federal government does or not. And we see some flipping with this question in this period. Brandy Holcomb's work on this describes it as rooted in some of the early cash transfers to Civil War veterans as setting a precedent where those types of expenditures were not politically acceptable. They weren't viewed as being within the bounds of the constitutional constraints on the public purse. But that viewpoint changed, and Randy's work gives us a good starting point for sort of figuring out where in time we can observe that change happening. Robert Higgs's work in Crisis and Leviathan gives us a sense for how leaders respond to circumstances changing, including viewpoints in response to those circumstances. And so what Pete and I do in the paper is, on the one hand, the top right book there, to promote the general welfare. That's Dick's work on using the state to redistribute income and wealth for purposes of pursuing objectives of social moral justice and social equality and so forth, as opposed to using market mechanisms. And then, of course, in his work with Buchanan on democracy and deficit, we have the government assuming some role for macroeconomic stabilization. So Pete and I gather G as being, on the one hand, responsibility at the micro level for household economic security, and on the other hand, on the macro level for stabilization. And over time, that contour that you see there, those items began to have more of a place inside the contours of, yeah, the federal government needs to be doing that. When we talk about G as being those items, this period is when G is becoming more and more into the contours of, this is what the federal government does. So we tell the story that way. We continue it with early 20th, that idea, that institutional assignment being formalized into things like the Social Security Administration Act, some organizational changes in Congress that made the budget more like a commons, and so forth and so on, that formalized this institutional rule. And then later, leading to chronic deficits, and this rule showing its durability, because even in the face of chronic deficits, and even in the face of multiple major legislative attempts by Congress to instill fiscal discipline, this norm of placing economic security and macro stabilization, firmly within what the federal government does, that has won the day. And we know that because of the profile of rising deficits and debt. Another way to put that is the formal constraints to try to limit future Congresses and instill greater future fiscal discipline is losing out to that informal norm of, yeah, we believe the federal government does these two things, even if it means it's financed through chronic deficit. So that's our story, and I think that what it does is it motivates this paper, because I want to get at this what this story shows us and what the vignette on the Greenway shows us, which is that institutions come from somewhere, they emerge, they grow, they can flip, they can die out, or they can harden and become formalized. They can become formalized so much that like people refer to them as third rails of politics. You know, that's a very strong, durable institution that gets described with that label. But sometimes they can be overturned. And so forth. And that's the central preoccupation with this paper. And so in order to build a little bit of a framework, I draw on the work of Searle, especially his X counts as Y and C. I go into this in the paper. I think we could spend a good chunk of time talking about it and me explaining it, and not get a whole lot farther than me just sort of mentioning it in passing with this slide, and say that the thing that I'm drawing upon the most is this speech act and this status function declaration that people's speech acts embody, and that the accumulation of these through repeated interaction is the stuff of which institutions are made. And so Searle focuses our attention on institutions as constitutive rules. They make our interactions possible first, but then as constitutive rules in making our interactions possible, they also set up the rules of the game. They regulate our interactions, both with each other in group and outside the group with others as well. The framework of X counts as Y and C is what I'm going to be leaning on the most. What he refers to X as is anything any phenomenon of the community's shared existence. It can be physical or not. It can be an idea. And then Y is this: we're assigning a particular status to this idea in our community. C. You can do a quick Google Scholar search, and X counts as Y turns up about 2,080 references. So I'm combining this idea with some of the work from Ostrom, some of the elements of the IAD, in particular, the definition of action arena. I'm going to use that to fill in where Searle leaves off on community. I'm also going to treat communities as forming along geographic as well as non-geographic margins. The community forms with boundary rules. Boundary rules are different from other rules because they determine who's in, who's out. But then once you're in, you have within group rules that determine your positions, your power, your expectations, your everything else within that group, within that action arena. And so, you can think of communities as forming along these boundary lines. And within those boundary lines, within those communities, those within group rules apply. And some of them are in form and some of them are in use. That's what I'm borrowing from Ostrom there. Okay, so, and then by comparison, institutional analysis and development is about 9,390 hits on Google Scholar. So just sort of moving forward, what we have is by combining Searle and Ostrom in this way, almost a sequence that can help us to think clearly about this institutional formation problem that I'm trying to tackle. It begins with thinking individuals, cognition. Thinking individuals interact with each other, they exchange ideas, they communicate with each other, they use status function declarations with each other. They do that in repeated interaction over time. That accumulates over time to some collective recognition of things in their world, of ideas and what their place is in their society, in their community. That collective recognition leads for some ideas to collective acceptance. Yes, that pile of rubble actually is a boundary. It counts as a boundary for us, even if the physical boundary isn't there. We can collectively accept that. We can see that in the sequence. And then finally, this is the culmination in Searle's, what we get from Searle's framework. It culminates in the collective assignment of status to certain ideas. as being institutions, and then other ideas it doesn't. So that's putting it simply, and I think that in the interest of time, that's a good idea. I want to go for not too much longer. So let me just sort of get to if you have if I'm leaving some things that linger as questions or what or comments, we can get to those. Just so that I don't speak for the whole time, I want to move on. All right, so that's what I kind of assemble from Searle and Ostrom, is this framework for thinking about institutional formation. And this idea of it happens in a community, and then whenever that community assigns this status, that's when we have it. But you know, I think that it's fair to ask, and I do it naturally as a public choice guy. What's the collective action process by which people in this community do this status? If that's collectively done, if it's a collective assignment, well, from a public choice perspective, we're really interested in what are the collective action processes there. You know, who are the free riders, how are they enforced, and so forth and so on. You know, what is the repeated interaction of people in a fishery, in an inland fishery, in the way Ostrom illustrates to us. You know, how might that apply in one of these communities? That collective action, let's get into that. And then two is I think a question that any economist would want to ask, which is, you know, X compared to what? And you know, that's something that we can think about as competing ideas for institutional arrangements. And then, you know, the third thing I'd like to do is account for this flipping and emerging and hardening and formalizing and sometimes reversing thing that we see a lot in institutional change. And so one thing I want to do is spend just a moment this is coming back to a point I mentioned about there was more Wagner's stuff and what I'm doing than I realized. But when I went and prepped for this talk, I found some cool stuff I wanted to just kind of throw along a little bit. But here's his review of Mansur Olson's Logic of Collective Action. This review was published in 1966. It was in the first issue of Public Choice. It wasn't called Public Choice at the time. It was called Papers on Non-Market Decision Making. Interesting factoid. The Public Choice Society actually decided upon its name. It was called the Committee on Non-Market Decision Making for a few years in its first few years. But then there was they decided to change its name to the Public Choice Society. An interesting factoid: they used a voting mechanism to do that. They took a vote. It was either this, or it was either Public Choice Society, or it was another. I forget what the name was. But it was a vote that established the name of the Public Choice Society. Anyway, that also carried along with a change in the name of the journal. But even before that, the journal was called Public Choice. Here's Wagner's review of Mansur Olson's famous book. Now, Wagner, I would say, I think it's fair to say, takes issue with a couple of attempts to generalize what Olson is doing to an explanation of all of political behavior. I think that's the theme of this review. And you know, one point that Wagner makes along the way is, it says, first of all, individuals are members of lots of different groups all at the same time, and that can serve as an internal check on what that group does, because those individuals are each they're composite of interests as members of different groups. And so that's one of the first things that I pick up. And I think that the members in these communities that I'm talking about are also going to be members of multiple communities at a time, and they can have deontic rights and responsibilities and powers coming from one group that don't necessarily apply into their role in another community, and tensions can arise that. So important to keep that in mind. And Wagner saw it from the get-go, so to speak, in the interest group approach to all this. Second point that Wagner gets at is pressure groups are not effective on their own. It's not so much of the reaction to Olson's book was directed at the size of interest groups and the size of firms and large organizations being able to. But Wagner's point here is that, look, even if a firm is sized optimally, or even if a pressure group is sized optimally for, minimizing its monitoring and enforcement costs, that's not going to be sufficient for political influence. In order for that cost parameter being low for this particular organization to map onto political influence requires, number one, we have to have a political entrepreneur, and number two, we have to have institutional arrangements that they all play in. And so that's his other two big points that I saw in the review that that I lean on in describing what's happening in these communities and the coalitions that build to say what does count as why and what doesn't. So if you want to just sort of see it in a way that even I can understand, I put this together for just gathering my own thoughts. Is like there's some folks in a community, and they're not all assigned even weights, and they're all part of the same experience. They can have a hurricane come through their community. They can have a pandemic. They can be they can have a technology shock. But all of that being their part of their definition as a community, each of them is evaluating ideas, individual ideas xi in the community c at time t. Some of those ideas are going to make institutions through the processes of collective recognition, collective acceptance, and collective assignment of institutional status. But the rest of them are not. And maybe the rest of them, they kind of go back into the mix, or maybe they just fall away and nobody ever talks about them anymore. I don't know. But the key that the important part that I'm trying to focus on is if we could say that people in the community choose X to be an institution or they don't. And there's some interesting stuff about the collective action process and how they make that decision. All right, so moving on, almost there. Here's what I do with the Searlean X counts as Y in C. The first is I say, okay, some of those are going to count and some of them aren't. The second assumption is if it does count, say it's Y equals 1. If it doesn't count, say it's Y equals 0. And then third, if it's an informal institution, just use lowercase. And if it's a formal institution, just use uppercase. And so I know there's a lot of discussion around this, what is formal and what's informal. And I don't want to say that I'm not interested in that. I don't want to say that I don't think that's important, but I don't want to get into that in this paper. There's enough going on. I don't mean to dismiss it as a point of comment discussion here either. That might be really good to get into, but I'm trying to avoid it in the paper, as you might be able to tell. So what that does is it leads me to be able to articulate 4 conditions. If Y ICT equals 1, then idea XI counts as an informal institution in community C at time T. And so that's the definitional framework. If it's equal to 0, then it's not an institution. If you change it to capital letters, then it's formal. If you look at whether it's equal to 1 or 0 in consecutive periods, and if you look at how that changes over consecutive periods, you can say something about institutional change there. And then finally, we can talk about institutional alignment by saying whether the capital and the lower cases are combining with each other. I'll sort of try to blow this up so you can see the table. I think it's a little bit more useful to conveying the point. So if an idea is not a informal institution and it's not a formal institution either, that's this upper left part of the categorization. And then if it is informal and it is a formal as well, then when that's bottom right, I try to put some examples in there and some concise wording just to sort of give a flavor of a lot of attention gets paid to alignment in the literature. So I'm not trying to reinvent anything here as much as I am sort of summarize what I'm trying to do here is use this adapted framework to summarize a lot of discussions that people have about institutional alignment. So those are the four things that I want to articulate in the paper at this point. And then, you know, I think that what it does is it allows to come back to this U.S. fiscal policy history and say that we can, if we can divide that into periods as listed here, we can take the history of this idea of spending G, okay? And again, that idea is spending it on household economic security and macroeconomic stabilization. Does that count as what we should be doing with the federal government or not? Federal budget or not? And in 1880, I think the claim would be that that is neither an informal institution acceptable in discussions that happen over the kitchen table on Main Street, nor is it a formal institution. There's nothing that is interpreted as requiring the federal government to do that, whether it's written or not. It's just not an institution. Moving forward, however, you might have a Randy Holcomb flipping effect here, where G, if G is interpreted as we should send some money to those sort of Civil War veterans, then that becomes into the one category during that period. It remains out of the formal institutions until the modern, until the mid-century era. Excuse me. This is sort of beginning at around the time of the passage of the Social Security Act and continuing up until the beginning of the modern budget era. We have a lot of organizational changes in Congress that, as I mentioned, create more commons access to the budget. And those are, we argue, formalizations of this norm. And so in this period, we would categorize both the informal and the formal as one. And then moving forward, we have those two continue as one in the modern budget era, but we have this other institution, which we talk about as 5 decades of legislative attempts to rein in Congress's spending to instill fiscal discipline instead. And I just label that as capital X inverse. And so this is a formal institution that says, let's do less of that. Let's get less of the federal budget doing household economic security and macro stabilization. Let's have more fiscal discipline. And so that has also been a one in the modern budget era. And so this is where I would say that it's important to think about strength and durability, because, you know, I mentioned how this is an attempt to do fiscal discipline, but it's losing. We know that because deficits are chronic and debt continues to climb. It's this informal norm that's very strong. And it's written into the third rail of politics. It's really strong to where these deficit reduction measures are relatively weak. So to get at strength and durability, one thing that we can do is we could say, what's happening inside this coalition, inside these communities? And you know, how much weight is there behind this assignment of institutional status? One way to do that is to say, does everybody agree? Is it unanimous? And you could do that treating individual viewpoints in an unweighted fashion, right? Just every person's vote counts equally. Or you could do it in an unweighted fashion where there are some political entrepreneurs, there are some influencers, there are some power disparities in the community, and it's an unweighted. But either weighted or unweighted, you can capture the strength of it by saying, relatively speaking, how much weight in the community goes behind this collective assignment of institutional status. Is it murder, right? The full weight of the community goes behind the idea that murder is wrong and it should be reflected as wrong in the way we do things. Call it the law. But what about recreational cannabis? There's a lot of disagreement about that. There might be less weight assigned to the idea that, you know, cannabis ought to be something that people can use freely and openly, and as long as they're not, you know, harm principles, so forth. And so what you can do is you can use a simple log of this relative weight behind it to describe institutional durability. And, you know, sort of, and at this threshold, you might say that's where Searle lives, at this threshold. If you're below that threshold, you're not an institution. And you know, if you're above that threshold, the farther up on that log curve you are, the stronger of an institution you are. And so, you know, that's where I would locate the fiscal institutions that are pushing the pressure on the upward pressure on deficits and debt. And, you know, not a normative statement, but look, nobody blinked an eye at their most recent, at the first round of stimulus checks in 2020. It was interesting to see the Republicans in the Senate mount successful opposition to, you know, it looked like fiscal discipline. And so, you know, we see this unfolding, or we continue to see this unfolding. I think another, and then sort of the last point, I touch a little bit in the paper on how, you know, look, I work at Western Carolina University, and we're kind of a remote, rural campus, and as one of the larger organizations in the region, the university matters a lot, and it shows like at a lot of campuses, it shows in, you know, like our formal mission has a lot to do with economic development in the region. And, you know, we devote some resources to that, lots of positions and stuff like that. So my center is along for that ride, in the sense that I am in the business of, you know, informing, using economics to inform, you know, the issues that are important to economic development in the region at Western. And one of the things that I've found is that there's a little literature that says, what do you guys think, Mr. Man on the Street, citizens polls, compared to what do you guys think, Mr. Elected Official? And there's been a little bit of movement to build that out into other key groups. I would think that key groups mainly are, you know, businesses, households, nonprofits, and you know, governments and officials. You might throw some mini categories on top of that, but the idea is to go out there and survey these individual groups and say, hey, what do you think X counts as, or do you think that X counts as Y? Where the rubber hits the road is there's some disagreement about what really is economic development. Is it growth and jobs and incomes, or is it instead, you know, amenities and environmental justice and quality of life? And we can get at, you know, the weight of a community's assignment of those relative factors as, you know, what does this community really prioritize and when it comes to defining economic development. And then we can run from there. You know, what are the mechanisms that you like? Nobody seems to like, you know, these directed incentives like tax increment financing, but, you know, lo and behold, you turn around, the next newspaper headline is, you know, so-and-so company creates 800 jobs at 35 million of, you know, incentives out the window. So nobody seems to like them, but they're very popular and common anyway. And then what's interesting is that, and for me, this is a little bit of a full circle point, because I started my, you know, early research doing logit models and probit models of voting, is that all of this falls nicely into McFadden's framework of discrete choice estimation. And, you know, logit models, good old fashioned probit marginal effects estimates. So that's my story. I know there's a lot of stuff going on in the paper that you might have scratched your head about. I apologize for not getting a tidied up version to you. There are some strands of thought that I start and don't finish in there, and there's some stuff in there that probably won't make it. So thanks for having a look if you did, and thanks for having a listen just now. I'm gonna let Marta take over for a second, and I'm gonna see what the chat was all about.
Okay, yeah, and thanks, Ed. Great, thank you so much. And actually, I think we should start with the chat. I wrote down three names from the chat, so maybe we'll just have folks from the chat just rephrase their questions, and then we'll open up the general queue. And I'm gonna stop sharing the screen so that we wait.
Well, that's okay. My last slide is just.
So we can all
how to
see each
find me.
other. Yes,
Yeah, I think y'all know how to find me.
Can you stop sharing so that we can all see each other?
Oh, I'm sorry. You want me to stop the share? That was a me.
I don't-
That was a me thing. Yeah,
All
there
right,
you go.
perfect. Okay.
Good.
So the first person, I have Nate, Eric, and Abby, and then we can just go, just from the room. So, yeah. Eric was, sorry, Nate was the first on my list.
Hey, yeah, thanks, Professor Lopez. I think there's something interesting happening here. Michaela Novak and Nathan Goodman and I each presented papers touching on some of the same material at Arizona State in November, and some really fascinating stuff. One question that I have for you is decision making. And it seems to me that in an informal institution, there's no central locus of decision making. So it's analogous to the marketplace, whereas a formal institution has defined identifiable decision makers that then allow for political exchanges. In informal groups, there's no political exchanges that are occurring because there's nobody who can make the decision to make that exchange. And just your thoughts about that idea.
Yeah, that's a great point, and I think that it's why what happens on the Greenway is interesting to me, and why I don't know if it'll survive in an academic paper, but that's why I asked the question is like, how does that work? Because it's to your point, it's like there's no real obvious way of which it's enforced. Like who's in charge? The who's in charge question is not obvious. So, but I think that really does open up some really important factors when it comes to like doing empirical work. One way of casting what I'm getting at is I'm saying that I want to do opinion polls and call them institutions. Maybe that's just an opinion poll, and it's not an institution. And what you really need for an institution is that something that's identifiable and easy to answer the who's in charge question. And I think that that's right. I think that that's totally right and fair, but it leaves some things out. And one of the things it leaves out is that oftentimes you don't have this obvious answer to the who's in charge question, but things work, and they work for a really long time, where you might suspect there to be conflict instead, routine conflict, but instead everything works pretty good. There's nobody in charge. So I don't know. That's not really an answer to your question as much as it is to say that what I'm interested in is those things that get left behind on that question, and how does it work when it's not clear what or who's in charge.
Have you looked at using Smithian sympathy exchanges as a way of explaining through approbation and disapprobation which informal institutions are sustained?
Yeah, I think that's bundled into these speech to these status function declarations. I think that one way that I describe the communicative interactions in this community is just the exchange of ideas. But I do carry Smith along with me when I'm thinking about that, and I don't always word it this way because I don't want to be confusing, but I think of it equally as exchange of sentiments. You know, there's so much of, you know, what is, you know, what are the margins of propriety in a delicately defined, you know, social situation. That's something that's a very hard thing to detect, you know, what and who's in charge here. And, you know, there's a lot at stake, whether you are known to be, you know, a member of a cultivated family or not. If you do the wrong thing in a setting like that, you know, that's what's at stake. So, and it works. So I think the exchange of sentiments and exchange of ideas are all along for, you know, built into that part of the adapted framework, the status function declarations as exchange of ideas.
Okay, I think Eric would be next.
Thanks, Ed. This is, I think, a really important topic you're pursuing here, especially the link between norms and what you call formal institutions. You know this already, but for the rest of the call, I'm in the camp of people who do not believe norms should be construed as institutions. Instead, they're a distinct subset of social rules. But I won't belabor that's semantics right now. Instead, I'm curious about your thoughts about the evolutionary dynamics you're interested in examining between norms and institutions. I tend to see them as norms seem to precede institutions, or formal institutions as you call them, in most instances. But I have a few questions that might help sort of get some more granular details about your thinking on this emergent process. Do norms always precede institutions? Can someone feasibly set out to change a norm other than through a formal institutional process? So we might change formal institutions because we don't like the extent to which a norm is held by the rest of the population. But finally, is there, in your mind, do people approach norms and formal institutions in their own head when choosing to conduct their behavior in similar or identical ways? And I want to just briefly explain what I mean by that question, which is to say, a rule, a social rule, whether a norm or a formal institution, really becomes interesting when an individual wants to behave contrary to it. Otherwise, it's not a particularly interesting lift when I say, I don't want to wear white athletic socks with my nice suit because I don't like how it looks. I'm not even engaging in the thought process of whether someone will chastise me, whether professional outcomes will go awry for me in that interview in which I wore those white athletic socks with a suit. But if I happen to hold the deviant preference, then the calculus becomes much more interesting with respect to whether it's a norm or an institution. For me, when it's a norm, it's, is this preference that I don't hold sufficiently held by enough other people that some set of inchoate consequences will be visited upon me if I violate this norm? In contrast with an institution, it is, has a rule been articulated by an organization with enforcement capacity against me? And am I likely to encounter one of those enforcement agents when engaging in my deviant behavior as contrary to that social rule? For me, this is kind of the core argument that surrounds why norms are so fundamentally different than institutions as articulated by organizations. And so we don't need to wade into, are they properly called institutions? But I'd like to hear your thoughts about the implications of this for the very important emergent process you're describing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's so much to discuss there. I mean, with you have a rich stance on that, and I think that there is a lot to be learned from focusing on where it's important to distinguish between norms and institutions as you're using those terms. Let me try on the norms preceding formal first. I can come up with examples that where it doesn't. They involve repeal of formal legislation or formal institutions because people don't like it anymore. All right, so airline deregulation is one. You know, what we have here are taxi cab medallion delicensing is another. What we have here are technological shocks that make the old way of doing things, which had been formalized into institutions, as you're using the term. But they needed to be reversed. And I think that the reversal process begins with a new norm taking foot, or a new informal rule taking foot that says, no, I think it's dumb that passengers pay twice as much to fly Boston to DC as they do San Francisco to LA. It's the same distance. You just cross the state line and one, so the federal government determines the price. No, that's a dumb idea. We should get rid of that. And so that informal rule, that way of looking at things, increases not only in the number of people in the community who change their mind or become aware of it, but also in their weights, their individual weights. And so Alfred E. Kahn becomes aware of that, and his weight matters a lot compared to, you know, somebody else who became aware of it later. He was one of Wagner's political entrepreneurs that got the idea through. So I would say, you know, Eric, I don't think that it's important to what I'm doing to consider informal rules as always preceding formal, and I can think of at least a few examples where they don't. I'm not entirely sure how to wrap my arms around your deeper point there. But again, I think it's worthy, but it's something that I'm trying to avoid with the piece.
Alrighty. So next, Abby was one of the people from the chat, and then we'll open up to the room. So Abby, go ahead.
Thanks, Marta. Great talk. I think this paper overlaps quite a bit with something I'm working on for the Public Choice Society at the moment, which is envisioning action arenas as games and the entanglement of action arenas as relationships or overlapping games in which players don't play every single game. And we can define membership in games also in terms of networks. And so I kind of wanted to go down this route a little bit with you, because I do see a lot of what you're doing can be made very simple using a network analysis. So all the way down to looking at degrees of influence and weighting decision makers' degrees of influence greater. So if you model any community as a network whose edges are defined, say, by the adoption of the same rules, and whereby information can then flow through the network, you'll see that there will be many kinds of these communities whereby you'll have multiple memberships, say, in these different networks, because people, as Dick said in his review, are parts of many different kinds of communities. And this can be very easily formalized using network analysis. And then, of course, you have uneven weights naturally. People who with more influence will be higher degree nodes in this network. So they'll have greater number of memberships in a variety of different communities, or they may even say be a member of a political community, which by its nature is connected to everybody else. And their role of decision maker can even be expressed as using a directed edge, where the influence between that, that individual, that political decision maker is directed towards the citizens and sort of not in the same way back. So you have to go through a different kind of mechanism, which is voting and the majoritarian way of voting with rents and all of this. That exerts influence on, say, who is a decision maker, but you don't have that direct feedback as you would with a sort of an undirected edge in a community, which you would have, say, in smaller communities. This also, you have Eric's point naturally following from this, right? That why would norms tend to precede laws and this sort of thing? Norms precede these other institutions because you start sort of in incubating a norm in a smaller community. And then, people who share membership between communities, the norm may be able to then transmit to other communities. This is how people get ideas for a certain kind of norm. Well, you know, this worked in my fraternal society. This kind of, you know, welfare mechanism seemed to work in my fraternal society. And there's a bunch of decision makers in the political institution who are also in fraternal societies, and they have this kind of welfare norm as well, helping out members. So why don't we try this out in the political community? So that's how these ideas get generated. And the extent to which people are sort of members in different communities, like say everyone agrees that murder is wrong, you can just envision that as a huge network where everyone's connected to each other, where the edge defines, do you agree that murder is wrong? And so then that idea, murder is wrong, is going to flow naturally through other communities of which they're members. And so it's, and perhaps this is not how you formalize things. I know this is a different way of formalizing things entirely. And there's other ways that you can formalize things by looking at interactions as games, right, within the communities. But I just wanted to express this way of perhaps looking at things and want to know what you thought about that.
Yeah, I think that sounds like a natural direction for it. And when you know, when in Savannah, you know, we can spend a little more time maybe talking about it. I did see that as kind of one of the directions I might need to go with the paper in order to get it over a hump at a good journal. Or, you know, I was also just thinking of a Becker model also, because I'm leaning on pressure groups as my sort of orientation. And I at least want to see what I could do with that, to see how it can be used to get this threshold of collective assignment. So that's kind of one idea I have. I haven't really gotten too much going on that just yet. But yeah, definitely that would be cool to fill in. Like I said, I want to fill in the collective action behind this Searlean counts as process. So Marta, should we go next in the chat?
Okay, do we have, well, I did say we will open to the room. So are there people in the room? Okay. Just raising your hand, or if not, we can go back to the chat. Is there anyone who just, I have everyone on the screen. Okay, I have Vlad. So Vlad and yeah, okay, so Vlad.
Hi, Ed.
Hey,
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, so at one point in your talk, you mentioned that there is a, hey, I'm talking.
Perfect.
No worries.
Sorry.
No worries.
He wants to tell you something.
Every time Becca tells, oh Joe, oh Joe, oh Joe, oh Joe.
Okay. Come on. Okay. So you mentioned at one point this kind of connection between Searle's way of looking at institutions and the theory of collective action. And I think, yeah, that's a big thing that's missing in Searle's theory. Now he's crying. Because he just says what institutions in his view are, but doesn't really explain the collective action process by which those status functions are created. So yeah, so I think it would be kind of interesting to delve into that topic more and maybe use these examples as a way to ground the analysis, because it's very easy to just kind of go into a very vague direction if you don't have the practical point. So one idea that I'm thinking might be useful for you is to build on Buchanan's Ethics and Economic Progress book, the 95 book, where he's trying to create this kind of collective action theory of morality. So he's saying, look, when we have social norms, there's a free rider problem there, that we benefit if the norms exist, but at the same time, it's a public good that the norms exist. So there's kind of an underproduction of the public, of the social norms. So kind of how exactly are we kind of overcoming this collective action problem? And he uses this metaphor of paying the preacher, the preacher being kind of the metaphor for the agent that promotes the norm. So kind of the preacher is underpaid because everyone is free riding on other people enforcing the norm. So I'm thinking maybe you can use this idea to connect it with Searle, because in Buchanan's book, there isn't kind of a formal analysis of what the norms are. So that's kind of my thought.
No, it's a great point. So, and, pay the preacher is definitely, a way that I've talked about this paper with folks. And it also puts, I think, a finger on what might be viewed as a tension in the paper. Because on the one hand, I want to say how, the political entrepreneur is important. No, an idea on its own isn't going to have an influence. A pressure group, even once organized on its own, isn't going to have an influence. Okay, but on the other hand, I also want to say that institutional formation can be the product of people just pursuing their ordinary lives. And this piece is a follow-up on a lengthier, dirtier, weedier book chapter that I wrote for Pavel Kushar's and Erwin Decker's forthcoming book. And in that book, I really do sort of explore this. Look, maybe there's no two levels of entrepreneurship. Maybe people pursuing their economizing everyday lives are building and maintaining the institutions that they need to do so. But I don't necessarily think it's an either or, because one of the problems with institutional analysis is determining context, what the right context is and what the right model is for the analyst to use in that context. And you said what's missing in Searle, I've dabbled around. They don't talk about economics. Economists don't talk about them. I think that, he got interested in this probably after he read Ostrom. I can't demonstrate that. That's just a hunch. I'm biased. I'll confess that. And, but what's, I think that what comes, I think, fruitfully by combining them, and I'm just curious why they didn't really ever interact much, is putting some definition on what Searle means by context, using Ostrom's action arena to do that. But then also, as you mentioned, Vlad, filling in that missing piece of the collective action. So thank you for pointing that out. I do think that you would have to pay the preacher in some contexts, but not in those where people's economizing behavior is institution building on its own.
Okay, perfect. So from the room, I have Dick, Brian, Peter, and I think in the chat, the one person that we didn't get to is Tony. So let's go in that order, starting with Dick.
Oh, and I find myself very attracted to any kind of topic that has multiple moving parts, because I guess I just am not attracted to ceteris paribus kinds of settings. But thinking in this, I find, and I don't know what your thinking was in this paper, but I kind of sense a kind of an auction theory framework at play there, where the informal institutions emerge effectively through an auction kind of process. And there are other kinds of social processes out there too. I happen to be myself a kind of a partisan of people like Vilfredo, Pareto, and Gaetano Mosca and so forth, that operated from more of a dual kind of conflict kind of setting, in which you might model societies more in terms of games of trying to achieve positions of domination and avoiding positions of subordination. And that, I think that, I think one kind of theory of society thinks in terms of some kind of emergence of some kind of conciliation within a group. Another would think in terms of avoiding being subordinated and rather managing to be dominant. And I was intrigued, you had that table in the paper, but also you projected it here of, you had 4 time periods. And you had this transition, I forget the exact dates, 74, I guess was the last one and so forth. But the world certainly looks different across those 4 periods. And it seems like there's something that's going on that is relevant for your topic. And I found myself thinking, one of my big intellectual heroes is a philosopher from Johns Hopkins from the early 20th century, Arthur Lovejoy. And one of his books was actually it was a set of lectures. It was called The Great Chain of Being. And one of the main themes that Lovejoy developed there is the claim that we probably don't know where our ideas come from. In many cases, what we do is we try to give rationalizations that make us seem kind of smart, but we really don't know in many cases. And I was thinking in this, that surely it seems like over that period you're talking about, that there has been various kinds of dramatic changes within Western societies that I think are very important, and I don't know what to do with them. Too many moving parts. But for instance, the image that people have of themselves in relation to other people. I think there was a time when people in the Western tradition thought about themselves as creatures. I don't think that's so much true anymore. I think people more or less think of themselves as creators or co-creators. And I think if that kind of image of humanity is a bunch of creatures, where we're more in the status of fallen angels, you might say, whereas if humanity comes to think of themselves as creators, as kind of like risen apes, then I think that's, I don't know how to work it out, but I think these self-images as to how it is that we conduct ourselves, even what makes for a good pattern of action in society, I think is going to have to in some way feed back to these beliefs about how are we supposed to conduct ourselves, what makes for a responsible person, responsible action, and so forth. And that, I'm struck by that table and those 4 different episodes you have there, and think that there is something there, and it's something that fits in with these various kinds of sociological, perhaps more than economic, in terms of whether you ground a theory of society and its processes and institutions fundamentally upon some kind of desire to achieve concordance and find Schelling points and this and that, versus you ground society on a desire to be in the top and to avoid being in the bottom. And I don't know if there's any way of reconciling these, but I think this question about formal and informal Institutions is right in the middle of all this, and it raises the question of the relation between reason or rationality on the one hand and will in the other. And there's an awful lot of argument that wants to think that reason can dominate will and can bend will to the findings of reason. And there's my own predilection is the opposite, but would say that will tends to bend reason, which was, of course, was the Paretian kind of way around that. I don't have any specific help to offer yet, because this is a topic that has many movable parts, but like your dog park, certainly seems like something has been going on over that course of your diagrams, and that I sense it as Frank Knight used to make a great deal about the ethic of sportsmanship that most of Western institutions, practices, and so forth can be reduced to that. And I wonder how much of that kind of ethic of sportsmanship is even alive at all, and how that, if the absence of that or the withering of that emerges into different kinds of practices, like athletic teams stamping other teams' logos. This stuff is rampant. A president leaving town before the new president is inaugurated, all these kinds of things. Somehow this is all, I think, just bound up in the kind of topic that has to do with whether people are going to be able to work out their ways in the presence of these dogs, or whether we're going to have the heavy hand of government officialdom in some form or another come into play. And I think this is a huge topic you have, Ed, and I'm, well, anyway, I say I don't have anything positive to offer you, just perhaps my congratulations for agreeing to take it on.
Well, better words a student could not hear from his professor, so thanks. No, there's a lot of insight and in your reactions, and it's true. I think that I don't have conflict necessarily. I think that folks in my community are creators. I think they want to get stuff done. They're coming together for Buchanan style reasons to do things together that they couldn't do otherwise, but they need rules to do that. So yeah, I think that it plays itself out in a lot of different ways, including one of the lasting concepts I have from your courses is the university as a socialist enterprise, and consisting of many enterprises all over at every node of approval and every invitation of veto. There's somebody who's either trying to avoid insubordination or just cover their ass. And so I appreciate that part too. And I've always thought of universities as little socialisms after taking your courses many moons ago. Thanks very much, Professor Wagner.
Okay, Brian, did you have a question? Okay, sorry, I wasn't sure if there was a hand up or, okay, so Peter.
Okay, okay. So first I want to thank you for a very stimulating talk. And actually what I'm saying is actually merely a follow-up comment to Vlad's and Abigail's comments, but it's simply this. It strikes me that you don't need to specifically rely so much on Searle's account of institutions. I don't think that's objectionable, but it's not so much dependent upon that. And my understanding of the discussion on this is that there's these three main camps there's of trying to understand the best way to analyze institutions, and there's the rules camp, the equilibrium camp, and then the constitutional camp. And I think Searle does his utmost to try to set these in opposition to one another. And there's some work that I've learned about very recently that actually argues you can actually basically unite these three accounts pretty smoothly.
Right.
And if you the work I'm thinking of, if you haven't seen it already, is Francesco Guala's recent book, Understanding Institutions.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, basically, so Francesco is arguing the three camps really actually are more complementary than in opposition. And if you can, if you adopt his account, then of rules in equilibrium, you can get the Searle constitutions idea incorporated in that, and that allows you basically to use a lot of the tools that Abigail and Vlad were referring to.
Yeah, that's definitely the stream that this paper is in, and that unified framework is something that Searle has been very hostile against, and for the obvious reasons. But I do think that the two pieces that fit together more cleanly in the Guala and Hendricks thrust is constitutive and regulative. Have a little bit higher burden to connect those rules, because in some sense, with equilibrium, I should say, because in some sense that's taking on economics, right? But I've that's great work. And Jim Caden, I don't know if he's still here, and I have a chapter in the UFM volume on Doug North, edited by Nikolai Wenzel and Marroquin. Sorry, it's my, I want to say Francisco Marroquin, but it's not. That's the university. And in that we try to take the Guala and Hendricks step in a slightly different direction, but the idea being that once rules are constituted a la Searle, they also are regulative a la the way social scientists think about institutions as constraints. And that in turn generates the patterns of behavior that we oftentimes recognize. Yeah, is that? I think that, I mean, that's how I understand it. I definitely am connected to it.
Okay, perfect. So we are about to run out of time, right? We have time for one more question, and that's Roger. And I would say if anyone has any suggestions or anything like that, put it in the chat and I can send that to Ed after. You already have some good suggestions in there, so we will definitely share that chat later. But for the last question to Roger, and then we'll give Ed a minute or two to react to everyone at the end. Okay. Roger,
now I feel the pressure to say something, good or something. This is really stimulating. I think that's obvious from people's reactions, but I guess what kind of emerged after listening to your paper and the presentation and the discussion is to wonder if Searle's telling too simple a story about rules. Forget about unanimity, which always gives me an issue. I think it's just too simple. Let me think about a rule. There's the Brady rule that the prosecution has to disclose to the defense all the relevant evidence in the case. So that's the rule. It's pretty simple. But then how does that rule really happen? Well, you have to first of all make a request for discovery, and your request has to be very carefully worded. And so the prosecution works hard to honor the request while actually not honoring the request. Mm-hmm. And then when finally they have to actually deliver, they over-deliver, so that we bury the thing we don't want you to have, in all the other pieces of paper, and so on. Okay. And if I just don't just, don't reveal what I have in my files. Who's going to know? I'm the prosecutor's office. I want you to come in here and look at my files. Right? So the rule is complex and contentious. Is that in Searle? Because I haven't really engaged Searle because I've always found that whole basic setup perplexing. But my sense is that kind of thing, he doesn't really have that. How about that, Ed?
I think it he definitely puts you can see his system coming together over the years. You can definitely see that as his book and the construction of social reality is 1995, and that's a real, that's you can kind of definitely tell this is what I'm doing now with my philosophy of language that I developed for the last 20 years. This is where I'm doing it. This is what I'm doing now. I want to do institutions now. And he has cleaned up, if you will, filled in, if you will, that with some follow-up pieces in ontological journals and in a couple of follow-up books also. And so he's filled in some of the detail, but he still, I think, will take a hierarchical approach to some of the things that you're mentioning. So Barry Smith, philosopher at University of Buffalo, and Searle have engaged quite a bit. And I've just kind of put my finger on some of this stuff. I haven't really waded into it, but the flavor of it, Roger, is look, that's administrative, organizational, definitional type of work. Those are important tactics to fulfilling the sort of strategy that an institutional assignment would imply. We know that the institution is, better to have X number of people, guilty people go free compared to one innocent person being convicted. That would be something I think he would count in the institutional categories, but the specific rules of legal procedure he would count in more, in a different part of the hierarchy. I think that the rules in that part of the hierarchy would also follow the X counts as Y, but that C part is something he would describe more as administrative, organizational, procedural, protocol type of things. That's my understanding, where I am on Searle anyway. Somebody might have a better understanding of it than that.
Okay.
One thing I'll say real quick though is, it doesn't look like there's any discussion happening, from over to where those discussions are happening to where social scientists are happening. The Guala and Hendricks under Hodgson's editorial hand is a big exception there. But there's not a whole lot of economics or social science about this X counts as Y, and there's not a lot of economics in their discussions over there about what it means, what is the context C. So I will say that.
All righty, and I think with this we need to close. Thank you all for coming on and for the great discussion. Next month we will have Meg Tusinski speak. So, but great thanks to Ed for an excellent, thought-provoking presentation. Yeah.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. All right.
Thanks a lot.
Right. Get back to you.